Good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse Burton. I'm a senior researcher in the Energy Systems Research Group at the University of Cape Town. My team ran one of the only full sector energy models in the country. So, we've been speaking a lot about electricity today and, of course, yesterday as well. But what we do is we model not only the electricity system, but also transport, industry, all the kinds of energy services that are needed in the economy. And we look at kind of the most elegant way of meeting those energy services. I've been asked to speak today about the implications of fossil fuel economics and climate policy on the energy system. And we will talk about that a little bit, but I also thought I would show you some initial modeling that we did last year. We're now in phase 2, looking at long-term net zero climate scenarios for the country and the implications of that on the energy system. So, first of all, what's the context in which we find ourselves? So why are we talking about climate change in this presentation today? So, and fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are the main cause of one of the major drivers of climate change. There are, of course, very enormous health costs associated with air pollution and water, and there's also, of course, water pollution and other local environmental degradation. And as you'll see, the global shift in energy costs has reached a point now where new technologies are not competitive with fossil fuels. And so it's not only about climate change, it's also about doing what's most efficient for the economy. So yesterday, our presenters highlighted the climate change challenge for South Africa, the risks faced by Africa overall and South Africa. And also mentioned, I believe, the socioeconomic risks of being left behind in the kind of clean energy transition and the way that can impact us in terms of trade, exports, and innovation. So what is the climate challenge? Just to reiterate from yesterday, we need to reach global net zero emissions by around 2050, and net zero just means that any emissions that remain are balanced by the absorption of emissions in the same way, for example, in sinks. And one of the most critical aspects of this is the fair share contributions that consider development, capability, responsibility, and national circumstances. So I'll talk you through our nationally determined contribution, which is our climate target as South Africa for 2030, which balances these considerations. But it's also critical to note that this is a multilateral problem. Everybody has to act. And so one of the aspects that creates a lot of international tension is the distribution of costs and benefits. Africa has played a very small role in causing climate change, but at the same time, we're actually being excluded from new clean energy investment. The continent is only 2% of renewable energy investment, of global investment. So what are we going to talk about today? So I'll briefly go over the global trends in new technology costs and deployment. I won't belabor it. I think it's clear to everyone now, and investment trends globally where this has kind of gone. I'll talk a little bit about committed emissions, which is just the greenhouse gas emissions associated with infrastructure that is already built and is being planned, and what that means in terms of climate change. South Africa's emission profile and our very, very heavy reliance on fossil fuel. We're actually the most coal-intensive country in the world in terms of our reliance on coal for liquid fuels and for electricity. I'll talk through, there are many studies on the role of coal power in South Africa, which are very consistent in their findings that new coal power is not competitive. And then I'll talk you through some of the net zero scenarios and implications of that into the future. So just a very brief picture to show you the global trends in technology costs and uptake. So this is PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, concentrating solar power and batteries. And it just shows the cost reductions that have been experienced since 2000 in each of those technologies, some more than others, offshore wind not so much. In solar PV, an exceptional decline. Batteries, of course, are declining very rapidly. And in parallel to that, you can see these curves of uptake. So we're still at the bottom of this kind of shift. When people talk about the energy transition, we're really only at the beginning of the energy transition. And variable renewables, wind and solar, are around 10% of global electricity supply. Similarly, you've got a very rapid uptake of electric vehicles, but in fact, they're only in 2020 they were only 1%. So still very at the bottom of this innovation and deployment curve. I think what's interesting for people in this is this gray blocks just shows the fossil fuel costs. And you can see now since the mid to, just after 2010 and actually before in onshore wind's case, that it's now cost competitive. And this is the same also for South Africa. So we ran an auction program for renewables over the last 12 years. And we can see in that process and in the associated coal auction process that new wind and new solar is now much cheaper. What are committed emissions? I just think this is interesting if we're talking about climate change to see, if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees, this is how much GHGs, greenhouse gases, we can still emit. And these just show the emissions already associated with existing infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, cars, etc. This is the electricity infrastructure. And then this is new proposed plants. And you can see that if even without existing infrastructure globally, we're going to blow the budget for 1.5 degrees. And if we build what is currently in the pipeline, we will blow the budget for 2 degrees. This is the same on the right-hand side. It's the same. It's a different study, but the same idea, which just shows kind of the lifetime emissions locked in from all the existing infrastructure. If you recall from yesterday, I mean, for 1.5 degrees, we're looking at halving greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 for 1.5 degrees. So getting down to here, and you can see that the existing infrastructure is above that. So what does this imply? It implies two things. New fossil fuel infrastructure needs to be constrained, but also that the operating conditions of existing infrastructure will need to change. If we run power plants, for example, in the same way that we have historically, coal and oil and gas power plants, we will exceed the 1.5 target. And this comes with all sorts of physical impacts for the world, which we would like to avoid. So my group, the Energy Systems Research Group, as I said, they run one of the full sector energy models. It's called SATM. It's a full sector energy optimization model, which just means that when you ask the model to meet those energy services, warm showers, heating, cooling, lighting, it does that in a way that is cost optimal. So it tries to build you the cheapest system subject to the constraints that you impose on it. It has the technology mix, it has the power system, it has transport in it, it has industry. And it's also linked to SAGE, which is an economy-wide model. So we are able to see in this process the linkages in the economy of different future energy pathways. There are other modeling groups in the country as well. We actually are really we have an exceptional number of capabilities compared to the other parts of the continent in this regard. And all the models, some of them are more detailed on electricity, some are more detailed on economy, but actually there's quite high consistency in the findings, especially around new fossil fuels in South Africa. For background, for those who are not familiar with it, these just show you South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions in 2021. And I think what's striking about it is coal accounts for 68% of our emissions. So our mitigation challenge as a country is very much around coal and the phase down and eventual phase out of coal. And that's not just in electricity, although electricity is more than 40% of our emissions. It's also because we converted into liquid fuels, in coal to liquids, Sasol's coal to liquids. But it's not only that. There's also road transport, which is a large emitter, 12%. And of course, he has industrial processes and product use. And when you start talking about net zero greenhouse gases, which is a much longer, that's not by 2050, that comes later, it starts to matter also what is going on in your agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors. This is the same graph. It's just showing you for CO2 emissions instead of greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions includes things like methane. And then when we look at CO2 emissions, which is what we want to be at zero or net zero at by 2050, the energy sector is 94% of that challenge. So energy is, and electricity is more than half. And again, this is largely a coal challenge for South Africa. So I want to reiterate, South Africa really is an outlier, even against our peer economies. The BRICS is happening at the moment, but even against some of the BRICS nations, we have a much higher reliance on coal for electricity, and very heavily concentrated, of course, in Mpumalanga than other countries do. So the other speakers today and some yesterday have spoken about just transition and, kind of integrating renewables and nuclear. But I want to say that we undertake energy systems modeling to look at the entire system rather than single technologies. The energy system requires very long-term decisions. It's critically linked to social policy, economic policy, environmental policy, trade, industrial policy. And so, when you're looking at a 2050 or 2060 horizon, you really need to have a coherent way of assessing the decision-making, the planning and decisions. The modeling we do is driven by population and income and economic structure. And of course, fuel endowments matter. So what you have available to you as a resource is very important, but also development pathways. So the choices made over the last 50 years about our energy system have really created the kind of coal intensity that we see now, including subsidies. And so we have, if you want to change that development pathway, it requires changing urban systems, changing infrastructure, but also changing maybe the structure of the economy and having a more labor-intensive growth path. I said already, but just, to say again that this is really about meeting people's needs for energy services in the most elegant way possible. And the advantage of a full energy sector model rather than only power, although I'm going to talk a lot about power in the coming slides, is that you can also assess linkages between sectors. So, although every country will be different, we can see some general trends in the way that decarbonization will unfold across the world. Typically, that will be through clean energy, largely renewable energy, and renewable energy will be the major kind of shift there, and that's just because it's the most inexpensive. But we can also see that you want to electrify end users, so the electrification of transport, increased rail, electrification of industry. Those are all, and of course, energy efficiency. Those are all sectoral interventions that we see across countries when they look at their own decarbonization pathways. Of course, power system analyses are also very useful, and they assess both the technical and the economic features of the electricity system. And, often people say, oh, but what about when the sun doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? And I think these kinds of models are really helpful because they look at what we need in terms of demand for over the next 30 years. And they account for the features of those available energy technologies and resources. And they also assess what kind of complementary interventions you need in that system to meet demand. And those complementary resources are a feature of all power systems. So it's very difficult to have a power system that only runs on one thing. It's very risky. It may not match the demand profile that you have. So no matter what you're building, you want to meet demand and you want to do that in the most cost optimal way. And you want to do it with a portfolio of resources that have different characteristics. And that's because you have to balance the electricity grid below a second all the way across seasons. So on the question of fossil fuel economics and coal, I think it's very clear there's a huge body of work on this now in South Africa, and there's very consistent agreement that new coal for power is not part of building new coal is not part of any energy pathways that unless it's forced in, and also that coal for power decreases in the coming decades because we're retiring our older coal fleet, and it's not competitive to build new ones. So there are at least 11 different local studies showing that new coal isn't competitive against alternatives and not part of a least cost system. The ILP 2019 includes 1.5 gigawatts of new coal, but that was policy adjusted in, and it was because until the just transition plans are put in place. NBI and Boosters work on this using Plexos, that's a model, finds that emission reductions don't result in significantly higher costs in 2050, but the policy choices do matter. So for example, a nuclear dominant system would cost 16% more than a renewables dominant system if you were looking at a clean profile. The essay tied program of work has looked at different things, but one of their studies also found that limiting new renewables and building more coal results in job losses in the broader economy. So you have higher tariffs, and so you may have growth in the coal sector, but you would be impacting the rest of the economy, and so you have a net negative outcome. And I also want to just note, coal plants are very important for energy security if we can make them work again. And even in our low NDC and net zero scenarios, so even in ambitious climate scenarios, they're not turned off tomorrow. They play an important role, especially in seasonal balancing. But we do need to pay a lot of attention to just transition to, there are plants that are already closing. There are many mines that are closing, and I'll show you some work by some colleagues at UCT on that. And that process really does need to be managed. So we did some work a few years ago after the IRP 2019 came out to kind of assess what the effect of the new coal in the IRP 2019 was. And we did this because our modeling and the modeling by the CSIR and the modeling by Meridian all found that if you just ask the model to build you the least cost system, it doesn't build new coal. It's just too expensive. And so in each of these scenarios, we ran it without new coal, and then we added the 1.5 gigawatts so that we could see the total increase in costs to 2050. That total discounted system costs it's just all the costs in today's money. And you can see that when you force the new coal in, it costs 20 billion Rand more overall than if you hadn't had the new coal. And in each of these scenarios, if you have cheaper renewables, it ends up being 28 billion. If you have high externalities associated with the coal, it's also over 20 billion. And then we also assessed what would happen if we built those new coal plants and we wanted to meet our NDC target for 2030. So NDCs are just nationally determined contributions. In the Paris Agreement, in the multilateral regime, every country proposes what its own targets will be, taking into account its national circumstances and its place of development and its energy system. So our NDC is something that we ourselves have done the work on as a country and decided is our contribution to the international effort. But if you build that new coal and you try to reduce emissions to meet the NDC, you also have to strand other coal plants. So you have to turn off some of Eskom's coal plants earlier because there's a limited amount of carbon space, and you need to invest in more expensive types of mitigation. And so the costs of that new coal in the IRP 2019 is almost 80 billion when you go for the higher target, because we have a range, and when you go for the lower target, over 100 billion. And so it's very, very, that inconsistency is a very, very costly could be a very costly policy mistake. Similarly, because the modelers always want to test everything, the IRP constrained new wind and solar. And so my colleagues tested what would happen if you carried that constraint on in perpetuity. And you can see these are emissions. If you constrain the renewables, you have higher emissions into the future. If you don't constrain the renewables, you have lower emissions into the future. And what happens in that case is that you get a lot more growth in the coal sector, especially to 2050, because this is taken up by building new coal. But you have an overall impact on GDP because other sectors are having to spend more on electricity, and that comes with negative impacts. This is backed up by work done by CSIR and Meridian in 2020 called a Vital Ambition, where they just looked at different electricity scenarios only. This was the IRP scenario. This was a pure least cost scenario. And they looked methodically at what would happen if you tried to lower carbon emissions for the sector. So this is just emissions over time. You go from 4,000 million tons or 4 gigatons all the way down to 2. And these were different scenarios that they modeled. And they allow the coal plants to run or to run at low levels or to retire. And they partially compliant with air pollution laws. I think one of our challenges is that there's not been enough work on the effects of the air pollution on people and how we need to manage the coal closures for that. But you can see that there's very moderate increases in costs. These are just the total costs relative to the current policy trajectory. You can actually reduce emissions by 1,000 million tons, a gigaton, and it will still cost less than the existing IRP. And that's just the same with more information. So when people can look at it when they see the slides. So very briefly, I'm going to whip through the very many energy pathways that my colleagues have modeled on long-term net zero, and then delve a little bit into the nationally determined contribution. It's a lot. My colleagues have modeled 79 scenarios for net zero by 2050, and that was in phase 1. They're now in phase 2, where they're doing even more. And so I'm going to whip through them really quickly, but just to show you, I think one of the speakers yesterday introduced the idea of that carbon budget and the fair share, and the amount of emission space that South Africa as a country can take up. And this just shows you different greenhouse gas emissions trajectories for different budgets and at different land sinks over time, from 6, 7, 8, and 9. And I'm just going to show you a few of the scenarios for each of these. And you can see this is a reference case with no emissions constraint. What happens when we try and meet net zero by 2050? So in a 6, 7, 8, and 9 gigaton budget, so those are just the amount of emissions that can be emitted over the period. This is electricity demand by sector. You can see a very large amount of demand stays in industry. Industry is a large user of electricity already in South Africa. Quite a lot in residential, but this blue here is transport. So a tiny amount of electricity going into transport now for rail, but that very rapidly expands. And that happens across all of these scenarios because, once electric vehicles are capital cost comparable with internal combustion engines, it's much cheaper to actually use electricity for mobility. And of course, what happens is when you have a smaller budget, you electrify more end users, and so you have a higher demand over time by 2050. So in this very tight carbon budget, it's more than 400 terawatt hours, whereas in a 7, 8, and 9, it ranges from just above 350 up to 400. How does this look on the supply side? Again, just for these 4 scenarios, you can see a very large, this is gigawatts of total installed capacity, very large build out of wind and solar. We built quite a lot of gas plants, although you'll see in the next slide, we don't run them very much. They're there just for seasonal balancing primarily. These are also CCGT plants. You can just see a little bit of nuclear. This is Coburg in there. We don't see any new nuclear coming in over the period, but that's also related to the relative costs of nuclear versus alternatives. And again, in more ambitious scenarios, you need to build out more in electricity supply as you have a higher demand. These are batteries, and you can see batteries coming in all of the scenarios. This is similar, but it's just showing you the actual electricity generated rather than the gigawatts installed. And you can see across a smaller to a bigger budget, what really happens is the pace of operational phase down in the coal fleet is part of that. So that happens slightly faster if you have a tighter budget. Our fair share is between 7 and 9 gigatons. So there's quite some difference there for coal, but you can see coal carries on right until the end, until 2050. This is nuclear, this is Coburg, and this is gas. So there's also quite a big difference in how much gas electricity is generated when you have more or less ambitious mitigation scenarios. But wind and solar are doing the heavy lifting here. And this is because this is a cost optimizing model. It's trying to build you that cheapest system subject to the constraints that you are giving it. I thought because this is the National Science and Technology Forum, people would be really interested to see industrial energy demand. You can see much more electrification in industry. This is electricity. The orange is coal, so a reduction in direct coal use in industry happens. A big drop off in the mid-2030s, going down towards the end. And I think we have a speaker on hydrogen coming, so I also thought I would show you this because you can see hydrogen becoming an important energy carrier for industry and net zero scenarios over time. And different amounts of gas between 6 and 7, for example, depending on how tight those carbon budgets are. But again, electricity doing a lot of heavy lifting here, the electrification of end users. Again, this is just hydrogen. I thought it would be interesting for the next speaker because she's going to talk about this, that a lot more hydrogen use in in a tight budget than in a less tight budget. And it's the big blue one here is iron and steel. So converting existing iron and steel to direct reduced and green with green hydrogen. Also, one thing, just for small interest, because it's meant to be about the economy, but we're really working on that now more in phase 2. One of the more interesting findings is that these are all 8 gigaton budgets with the same land sink. But you can see that when you have energy efficiency, demand side PAMs is largely energy efficiency and the electrification of transport, you can actually have a positive impact on economic growth. And you can have an even more positive impact on economic growth, even in quite a tight budget like 8 gigatons, when you implement energy efficiency and demand side management, and if you target green hydrogen exports. So there's an interesting economic benefit to be had here, even with much higher levels of ambition, where we need to focus on policy implementation and energy efficiency, and potentially future green hydrogen exports. Again, and this is again showing you the same graphs as before, but just with and without export. So you can see a much greater production of hydrogen potentially in an export world, where we become one of the global leaders in that technology. So what does this kind of mean? There's so many scenarios it can be a little bit lost. So I've just picked one net zero CO2 9 gigaton scenario. So this is consistent with the upper range of our NDC. Very, very similar to what you've seen before. Gradual coal phase out, a big build out of new wind and solar. This just shows cars and motorbikes based on oil phasing out and electric phasing in. This is bus and minibus taxis based on oil phasing out and electric phasing in. But this translates into about 4.2 trillion rand in investment to 2050. And between now and 2030, around 940 billion. And this is for everything, right? This is for new generation. This is for grids. This is for cars. It counts all of that. The World Bank's finding is that you need about 8.5 trillion for mitigation, adaptation, and just transition to 2050. And so one of the really critical things that we're now talking about in South Africa is how to get greater financial flows into the country, because our cost of capital is much higher and that has an impact. And you can, of course, use climate finance to support some of this transition. And then I don't have much longer, so I'm just going to quickly talk you through the NDC, because I think that's one of the more topical parts of this discussion. This is similar to what you saw earlier. This is just South Africa's emissions at the moment. We're sitting at about 450 now today, around here. It just shows you electricity is almost half, synthetic fuels another 12%, transport 11%. The red line is our previous NDC that was from 2015 for 2025 and 2030, and the green is the updated NDC that gets us that for 2025, and in 2030 that's the 350 to 420 that I showed you earlier. And you can see there's quite a lot. We did a lot of modeling, my team, when this technical work was happening, also to assess all different kinds of economic growth rates, policy uncertainties, technology uncertainty, etc. So there's quite a broad range of potential future outcomes. South Africa's commitment here is 2-degree compatible at the top, and 1.5 degree compatible at the bottom. So really, if we want to do our fair share for that 1.5 degree target that's in the Paris Agreement, we need to be aiming to this bottom section of our NDC for 2050. Comparing it to the kind of the numbers you've already heard, a 9 gigaton budget to 2050 kind of gets you to that top, and an 8 gets you to the bottom. But the model gets to allocate that efficiently across the period. That's just showing you the fair shares. So what does that NDC range imply for what we need to build in the next, 6 years? These are gigawatts of installed capacity per technology and these are all different scenarios that were modeled for the NDC for that range. This is the whole electricity production. So you can see that by around 2030, in the upper NDC range scenarios are here, the middle range is here, and these are these 1.5 degree compatible ones. The coal sector is putting out around 100 terawatt hours of electricity, and a big chunk is coming from wind and solar, and some is coming from diesel or gas and hydro. This is also with and without energy efficiency measures. So you can see energy efficiency makes a huge difference in terms of how much you need to invest in the power sector in the years to come. So it's this big difference here. That's an energy efficient. That's how critical energy efficiency is in the future for in terms of investment and saving investment. Yeah, so again, lower NDC range, you're looking at a big chunk from wind and solar. And of course, there's still some coal there, providing inertia and balancing, etc. This just shows you all those different scenarios in that NDC range over time. So those are emissions. This is billions of investments required. And you can see there's a very large range in terms of what the investment might need to be, depending on what happens in the future. So depending on technology costs, depending on energy efficiency investments. Energy efficiency really lowers both emissions and the investments needed. So you can get, really down to that bottom part with energy efficiency at a much lower cost than, say, up here, where you'd have to invest 200 or 250 billion rand more in generation just to get to the same level of emissions. And so it's an area that really needs a lot more focus and support, I think, in our policy space. I'll skip this. Just one thing to note. I mean, talking about this scale, we've got a really large renewables pipeline, but we face very critical grid and financing constraints. We're really talking about deployment of VRE needing to scale up 10 times per year. So commissioning our current installed capacity of wind and solar per year every year. For the grid, this is the same, and this is relatively similar across different energy futures. We need to build a lot of grid no matter what, about 8 times at least per year of kilometers of wire, and 8 times as many transformers. And I think we need to at least be doubling our FDI, and we need to be focusing a lot more on financial ecosystem development, because there's a lot of existing local capital that's not getting into the energy sector right now, although lifting the requirements, the licensing requirements is, of course, going to help with that. And there's some really good work on this by the Africa Climate Foundation, looking at the private sector ecosystem and kind of some of these barriers to getting these investment flows going as quickly as we need to. And then I'm mostly actually a just transition researcher, so I want to flag that the just transition means that we need to look after workers, we need to look after communities in fossil fuel dependent regions. So for us, a lot of focus on Mpumalanga, but of course automotives is a huge one, because there's very heavy concentration in the Eastern Cape of automotive manufacturing. We need to be looking at worker transition planning. We need to be thinking about municipal financial sustainability and service delivery as the kind of transition happens in these places. There needs to be good technical assistance. There needs to be a lot of focus on energy access, for example. And there are actually a lot of criteria that we've been working on around what does just energy transition look like for Africa. So, can we talk about a just transition when there's trade and protectionism that's kind of locking us out of the global economy? How is that process going to be managed in a fair way? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, on ownership, benefit sharing, and local manufacturing. So, how the REAP has got some community ownership, it's been more or less successful. How do we do that in a more socially ambitious way? This is some work by my colleague Megan Cole she's in chemical engineering at UCT, and she's worked out how many mines are closing in the coming years. So this isn't because of climate policy. These are mines that are reaching the end of their lives in the next 10 years, this big chunk of mines here. And all of those mines are going to need to have proper environmental rehabilitation. They're going to need worker transitioning support. They're going to need community development support, livelihood support, because we've seen that in the past, there hasn't been good practices around mine closure. And so whether you do or don't have an ambitious climate policy anyway, there's a lot of work that needs to happen to ensure that there's justice for people in Mpumalanga. Otherwise, we're just going to have more abandoned mines. We've already got 800 abandoned mines in the region, huge problems with acid mine drainage and the like. I'll skip this, but it's just some of the work on financing that is being done to make sure that we can attract finance into really socially ambitious projects. Tips have just put it out. It's really helpful. So thank you. Thanks. Sorry, I went over. Normally we have 84 slides on the net zero modeling, so I got a bit carried away. I also just want to thank, we're part of a consortium called Imagine, which is a group of different developing country modeling teams who all work together on understanding future energy pathways. And we all learn a lot from each other. So we're very grateful to them. Thank you so much.
Dr. Titus Marty said, thanks, Jesse, for the presentation. In your modeling, do you consider power system grid stability, reliability and resilience, and spatial or location of new capacity and grid access constraints?
Thanks. It's a very good question. So this version of the model has a lot of resolution on sectors and on fuels, but not on temporal and spatial. We're working on that in a separate model. What we do for reliability and stability is we set a very conservative reserve margin constraint. So the grid is kind of modeled in a simplified way, but we have all the investment costs for grid strengthening is linked to peak demand and total installed capacity. The current grid limits for expansion, we also treat it quite conservatively. We basically set the availability factors of new wind and solar to be a national average, not Northern Cape. So we're not letting the model think it's getting Northern Cape sun, even though it's not. It's actually having to build it somewhere else. So not every model can do everything. So we also run something called Flex Tool as a simulation model, where we do much more fine-grained 15-minute simulations of a worst year, for example, and we feed that back in. And then we've also got a high-res version of SATM that is being developed. That's the more temporal and spatial version. I hope that helps.